Hey everybody, welcome back to Submarine History. Today we cover U.S. submarines for coastal defense, or the H through O classes. These boats were built between 1911 and 1918 and tend to be a little longer and offer more displacement than the harbor defense submarines we talked about in briefing number 39. That was the A through G classes. This makes the H through O classes suitable for operations in open water, but they're still not quite what we would call ocean-going or fleet boats. In briefing number 39, we talked about the first 12 years or so of U.S. submarine building, from the A class, which began construction in 1901, all the way through the G class, which wrapped up construction in 1913. There is a little overlap in the construction timeline, as the H-class submarines began construction during the same year as the E and F boats, which were the original pig boats. Read the description to this briefing. It has relevant related references and links. Last, but not least, thank you to the United States Naval Institute for all they do preserving and promoting world naval history. The work USNI does is invaluable. Consider supporting them with a donation or membership. If you have any questions or comments regarding this briefing, post them below in the comment section. I also have a Discord for more in-depth discussions, and you can find an invitation link on the channel page. As usual, for this series of briefings, our primary reference is Norman Friedman's book, U.S. Submarines Through 1945, An Illustrated Design History, published by the Naval Institute Press. We'll start the briefing today by talking about the evolving development and employment strategy for U.S. submarines. Then we'll briefly go over the H through O classes. We're getting close to World War I and the role of submarines, but we'll talk about that in a later briefing. I think we're going to talk next about early efforts to build fleet boats, and then we'll have a briefing on the S boats. That'll give us the background to talk about the U.S. submarines in World War I. Okay, so let's hit it. Lieutenant Lawrence Y. Spear. We introduced this chap back in briefing number 39. He's an 1890 graduate of the United States Naval Academy. He was assigned as an inspector at the Crescent Shipyard, where John Holland and Isaac Rice were building the first submarines for the U.S. Navy. Because of that association, Rice ends up hiring Spear in 1902 to be a designer alongside Holland. And when Holland leaves Electric Boat in 1904, Spear is elevated to company vice president. He becomes critical to the survival and success of Electric Boat, due in part to his prior association with the U.S. Navy and his understanding of the inner workings of that organization. Spear understood how to work the system, and he eventually becomes the president of Electric Boat in 1942, running the company arguably during its most important time period, then becomes chairman of the board in 1947 until he dies in 1950. We'll come back to him in a bit. Now, the U.S. had been building submarines for about 10 years when the construction of the H-class submarine starts. Those first 10 years weren't spent just building submarines. The Navy was trying to figure out how to employ them as well. Before World War I, before 1914, the thought was that submarines were a purely defensive weapon, ideally defending U.S. harbors, like with the A through G classes, and then eventually extending that to the defense of the U.S. coastline as the boats get bigger and more reliable, which is what we're talking about today, the H through O classes. Let me read through these talking points on the slide real quick, then we'll discuss it in detail, and then we'll get a little bit more detail on the following slide. Let's see here. Okay, U.S. submarine employment strategy pre-1914. Our primary target, capital ships. We have surface scouts far out to sea to spot for submarines. Submarines which are loitering are then directed to enemy ships, and then submarines attack and engage, either individually or actually as a group. The U.S. knew that in Europe, submarine design philosophy included providing 4 bow torpedo tubes because it was thought that that was the number of shots you'd need to sink a capital ship. And the U.S. begins providing 4 18-inch diameter bow torpedo tubes, beginning with the D class in 1908. Speed and endurance is a serious issue with submarines from that period, and let's be honest, it will remain to be a serious challenge all the way through the end of World War II. Now, the idea is that the Navy would have surface ships far out to sea working as pickets that could alert submarines loitering in designated areas of the U.S. coast. Okay, then those submarines would be vectored into an incoming enemy task force. It's interesting to note that even as far back as 1908, the U.S. was considering the possibility of employing groups of submarines in a coordinated fashion to attack a target. And at that time, it was thought that you could have a string of up to 5 submarines spread about half nautical mile apart, maintaining a position on the bow of a target and progressively taking shots at it. Okay, let's get a little bit more specific here. U.S. submarine tactics. Okay, we're going to approach our target on the surface. We're going to submerge after spotting our target. We're going to use our periscope sparingly, and that means showing 1 foot or less of the periscope for no more than 4 seconds. And then we're going to be periscope up from 2,000 yards in. That's our maximum torpedo range. Ideally, we're going to get 4 bow shots in on a capital ship fired from 500 to 1,000 yards out. A couple things to note here. First of all, testing in Buzzard Bay, that's in Cape Cod, indicated that submarines could be spotted approximately 1.5 nautical miles away. Friedman doesn't indicate if the submarine is surfaced or submerged in that situation. I'm assuming the boat is submerged but showing some periscope, and it's moving slow enough to minimize the periscope feather or the wake that's created. At that time, a submarine showing 4 feet of periscope could spot a large surface ship approximately 7 to 8 nautical miles away, while its own feather might only be seen from 3.5 nautical miles away. So this is why on approach, you're using your periscope sparingly, only enough to keep on course with the target. At 2,000 yards, we're only 1 nautical mile out from our target. Then we bring up the scope for the rest of the tack run, so we're right on that edge of that spotting envelope, and we're just going to go for it and fire all bow torpedoes from 500 to 1,000 yards out. The thing about this, there's no discussion about what a submarine would do if in fact it was spotted by its target. I think it's assumed that the target, a large capital ship, doesn't have enough time or ability to maneuver and avoid attack. In the event that the target or an escorting ship might spot the submarine would simply break contact by diving. Again, Friedman doesn't really mention it, but I'm assuming all these tests were done during daylight. Okay, so challenges with U.S. tactics for submarines. Periscopes are fixed height and non-rotating. Periscope feathers can be seen up to 3.5 nautical miles away. There's no radio communication until 1912, and submarines are not fast enough to catch targets. Let's see here. Fixed height. Okay. So fixed height and fixed view periscopes were a thing initially with U.S. submarines. Even though it was known in Europe, retractable periscopes were being employed. That would have added cost and complexity to the manufacturing process in the U.S. Plus, the U.S. did not intend to employ defensive measures like submarine nets and mines, which was thought would be a primary hazard to an extended periscope and why you might want to have a retractable one. Another aspect to the challenge of this using a fixed height periscope is that, because it's fixed height, every time you want to make an adjustment to your periscope height, you have to move the whole boat up and down, which adds a layer of complication to the process. Okay, let's see. We already talked about the periscope feathers, which is why in a submerged approach to target, you're just taking a peek for a couple of seconds with your scope from time to time. Initially, there are no radios on submarines. Now, Marconi patented wireless telegraphy in 1897, and it's still a very nascent technology in the early 1900s. Now, you would have seen radio installations in 1912 in large ships, think of Titanic. And finally, subs are slow. The hydrodynamic shape of the boats at this time optimizes underwater speed. But even with the O-class, they can't do more than 11 knots underwater, and only for a very short period of time because the batteries would get quickly exhausted. And if you look at something like the USS Texas, it could do 21 knots. And what would happen is that during exercises, submarines often failed to catch a target, even if they knew its course and speed. Okay, so how do we address these challenges? We have the introduction of rotating periscopes in 1904. We have the introduction of retractable periscopes in 1914. Installation of radios with range up to 90 nautical miles receive and 50 nautical miles transmit by 1912. And there's experimentation with snorkels in 1909 and compressed air in 1912 to supply air to diesels underwater so that they can travel faster. Yeah, so Electric Boat does start providing rotatable periscopes in 1904, and then they offer a retractable periscope in 1914. Quite a bit of engineering goes into periscopes. An Electric Boat, and likewise Lake Torpedo Boat, they both had trouble designing and building them. So eventually the Bureau of Construction Repair would step in and just take responsibility for the sourcing of those. And they did this initially by contracting with Kufel and Esser in 1912. They're a New Jersey company founded by German immigrants. And then finally with Kohl-Morgan Corporation in 1916, which had spun off from K&E. So beginning with the E-class boats in 1912, we do get temporary radio installations, which means there is a radio fitted to the boat, but the antenna has to be manually deployed to communicate and taken down before it can submerge. And it's interesting to note in the book that Friedman indicates that those early submarines could receive signals at 90 nautical miles and that they could transmit at up to 50 nautical miles. And it's not until the 1920s that it's understood that high-frequency radio waves could be sent and received thousands of miles away because of skywave propagation. So as early as 1909, the Navy approves the fitting of a vertical pipe connected to the engine air intake and extending it to within 1 foot of the top of the fixed periscope, so a submarine could use its diesel engines submerged. This is what we call a snorkel, and the concept goes back to the Turtle in 1776. Although Friedman doesn't make it clear if any boats were actually fitted with snorkels at that time, we do know that in 1914, the idea is revived again. Testing is done during exercises in the winter of 1914 and 1915 by running boats awash with engine ventilators closed and the conning tower open to simulate the use of a snorkel. And actually, this was common for U-boats to do. Just running with your deck awash, the conning tower hatch open, and your quote. You're doing a little bit of snorkeling, but really what that gets you in a position so that you can immediately dive when you need to. Now, this testing that the Navy did, this testing also included closing the conning tower hatch to seal the boat to see how long the engines would operate. Now, unfortunately, the Navy couldn't afford at that point to make any operational submarines, or they couldn't take any operational submarines out of service to retrofit and test them with snorkels because World War I is spinning up and, we had other priorities. There was also a proposal in 1912 to fit submarines with compressed air, which could supply the diesels while submerged. Bureau of Engineering didn't like the concept of using diesels underwater because they thought it was noisy, and the General Board felt there was a lot more development potential for batteries and motors. So the idea of snorkeling kind of goes nowhere, and the U.S. won't take that up again until after the end of World War II. So what actually was the plan for the employment of submarines by the U.S.? In March of 1909, the Naval War College proposed a total of 9 flotillas, each consisting of 6 boats, except for the Guam flotilla, which would have 3. And they would be spread out between the Pacific and Atlantic. There would be a total of 51 boats. Some of the flotillas would have, quote, long-range boats because of the expected patrol radius, although the term long range should be taken with a grain of salt, as the N class, only had a 3,500 nautical mile endurance. By late 1908, the U.S. only had 12 operational boats, and 8 of those were restricted to harbor defense. 7 boats were under construction, and another 8 had been authorized by Congress. So that's only 27 submarines either in service or planned, and that compared to England, who at the time had 60 submarines either built or under construction. Each flotilla would require at least 1 dedicated tender, which had to be capable of fueling and towing up to 5 boats. This was a difficult requirement to meet, as Congress was more willing to build submarines than submarine tenders. Friedman doesn't explain why Congress was unwilling to authorize the construction of a sufficient number of submarine tenders. We can speculate that it was probably lobbying by Electric Boat to Congress. Electric Boat needed to build boats to survive. And an example of this was the General Board's recommendation in 1910 to actually cease submarine construction until an adequate number of tenders could be built. Yet the Navy gets, for the FY12, 2 submarines and 1 tender versus the General Board's recommendation of just building 3 tenders. So that's kind of like how it would play out. On the subject of the General Board, there were questions about submarine range that the General Board wanted addressed. The General Board was interested in submarines with a range and speed that they could keep up with the fleet and maneuver with it. In briefing number 39, we talked about how early on Speer had a vision for U.S. submarines and their role, and that maybe the U.S. Navy didn't really understand what they needed. Speer saw U.S. submarines operating across the oceans far away from the U.S., which was different than Holland's view about boats for harbor defense. But Speer's vision was that submarines would remain small, less than 650 tons, and that they would either be deployed to a region with support ahead of time, or they would sail with the fleet at its economical speed of 11 knots, and then when the fleet got to where it was going, the subs and their tenders would set up base, and the subs would begin to take a defensive posture, protecting U.S. facilities. And this is contrary to what the General Board wanted, and probably to what we expect a submarine should be capable of doing, at least from the U.S. perspective. Europe was focusing on smaller boats, but when you look at their theater, they didn't have to go very far to engage an enemy, so you could afford to build a smaller boat. And from the previous slide, we can see that it was all about range for the U.S. There was a lot of back and forth between Electric Boat and the General Board on this subject of range, and Speer, at least for a while, was able to convince the General Board that smaller boats offered advantages. They were less detectable, better maneuverability, and they would provide the same power that a larger boat would do. Speer knew, but chose not to discuss with the General Board, that he knew a submarine capable of doing 17 plus knots on the surface, okay, well, we're talking about a fleet boat, that would have to be large with a ship hull form, but that larger boat would also be faster because you could put bigger power plants in it, and it would have more range because you could store more fuel, and that would make it possible for them to accompany and maneuver with the fleet. And again, just to wrap it up, it was about range and endurance for the Navy, but for Electric Boat, it was about contracts and volume. Now, there is another aspect to submarine construction during this time. Largely, decisions being made about submarine design and operation were being made, quote, at the top by organizations like the General Board, Bureau of Ordnance, Bureau of Engineering, Construction and Repair, all without any input from the submariners who were actually operating the boats. Now, this changes in January 1912 when Secretary of the Navy George Mayer created a board of submarine officers to review design and construction policy. And this board of officers would be invaluable as they were able to offer improvements to design based on their operational experiences. Okay, and then the last slide before we talk about the boats themselves. So these are all the different players who had input on matters related to submarine design in the U.S., their construction and employment. So if you want to pause the slide and just kind of look all those people who are digging in to have a slice of that submarine pie. It's pretty amazing that anything actually would ever get done. All righty, let's get on to the boats themselves. And here we have the H class. 3 boats were built between 1911 and 1914 for the U.S. Navy. 18 additional boats were ordered by the Imperial Russian Navy in 1915 and were built by a British firm in Vancouver, British Columbia. 12 of those boats would be delivered to Russia, but the last 6 didn't go because of the Russian Revolution. Instead, those boats would be purchased by the U.S. Navy. This is also the last boat class that could be offered to foreign navies. After the H class, Electric Boat would have to offer separate designs to other countries. These boats are 150 feet long with a 15-foot beam and a surface displacement of 358 tons. By the way, for measurements, I'm just rounding up to the nearest foot. If you need to know if it was 15-foot beam or 15 and 3 3/4 inches, you can go to the Wikipedia page for that. Let's see here, 4 18-inch torpedo tubes and 8 torpedoes, and these have the rotating cap on the bow to hide the torpedo tubes. We have 2 diesel engines, a crew of 25, that's 2 officers and 23 enlisted, surface speed of 14 knots and 10.5 knots submerged, surface range of 2,500 nautical miles. These boats were all decommissioned and sold for scrap between 1931 and 1933. This size of boat was what Speer thought was optimal. A small package with a low surface profile, maneuverable, and could deliver that devastating 4-torpedo payload. The K class. And note that we've skipped the I and J classes as class identifiers. 8 built boat between 1912 and 1914. Some of these boats did serve during World War I and were forward deployed to the Azores to help protect convoys. We talked previously about how the sails, or you can call it the bridge, the conning tower, sometimes it's referred to as the fairweather, they were really small on U.S. subs during this era. And they would rig a temporary pipe frame and canvas to make it kind of bimini so the crew would have some protection when they were, topside on watch. Also from the picture, you can see how the temporary radio antenna was employed. All these things would have to be removed before the boat could dive, so we're really not crash diving at all. But you didn't have to, as the plan was for these boats to be at sea loitering in designated areas ready to be vectored to an enemy, so you would have plenty of time to take down these structures. 153 feet long, 16-foot beam with a surface displacement of 392 tons, 4 18-inch bow torpedo tubes with 8 reloads. Also with 2 engines, diesel engines. Crew of 28, 2 officers, 26 enlisted. Surface speed of 14 knots, 10.5 knots submerged. Surface range of 3,150 nautical miles. And all these boats would be scrapped by 1931. The L class, 11 boats built between electric boat, lake torpedo boat, and for the first time the Bureau of Construction Repair at a U.S. government-owned shipyard, Portsmouth. This boat class was the first to introduce shutter-style torpedo tube hatches and a retractable 3-inch deck gun. These boats did participate in World War I, and with some operating from Ireland and others in the Azores as convoy escorts. So as I said, L1 through L4 and L9 through L11 were built by electric boat, L5, 6, and 7 were built by lake, and L8 was built by the U.S. Navy itself. The lake and Navy boats were different dimensionally and with different power plants, but they achieved the same surface submerged speeds as electric boats and the same surface range. And because of that, we'll just review the electric boat characteristics. These are 168 feet long with a 17-foot beam and a surface displacement of 450 tons. Also, the 4 18-inch bow torpedo tubes with 8 reloads. These also had 1 3-inch deck gun. 2 diesels with a crew of 28, 2 officers, 26 enlisted. Surface speed 14 knots and 10.5 submerged. Surface range 3,150 nautical miles. All these boats would be scrapped by 1933 as well. Now the M class was just one boat laid down in July of 1914 and not commissioned until February 1918. This was an experimental boat that was authorized along with the L class hulls. Bureau of Construction Repair designed this boat, and their hope was to demonstrate the potential of a larger hull and extended range, 6,200 nautical miles using main ballast tanks. Remember, Speer doesn't really want to build these big boats, but finally the U.S. Navy is starting to push back and say, we want to at least investigate to see how this is going to work. Now, what made this boat unique was the use of a double hull. And by double hull, it means we have a pressure hull and then exterior space and then a hydrodynamically shaped outer hull. And we can use that area in between the pressure hull and the outer hull to place things like tank, piping, etc., and still have low drag. Unfortunately, the boat was slower than expected, and it was unstable when diving and surfacing, so it was considered unsuccessful and scrapped in 1922. 197 feet long, this is considerably bigger. 19-foot beam and surface displacement of 488 tons. Also the 4 18-inch torpedo bow tubes, 8 reloads, 1 3-inch deck gun on the electric boat-built hulls. 2 diesels, a crew of 28, 2 officers, 26 enlisted. Surface speed, 14 knots, 10.5 knots submerged. So it's really not performing better than any of the other boats that they had been building up to that point. Surface range of 6,200 nautical miles. Now, caveat on that surface range, that was using the main ballast tanks as fuel storage, and back then that was a very kind of a risky proposition that repeated using the tanks between fuel oil and seawater, it could cause the fuel lines and stuff to gum up, so that had to be managed. Okay, the N class. 7 boats built between 1915 and 1918. N1 through N3 were built by electric boat, N4 through N7 was built by lake. These were the first boats to be installed with a permanent metal chariot-style fairweather, okay, or around the conning tower. Other boats would get this, but they were retrofitted during World War I. And these boats operated out of New London, Connecticut during World War I and patrolled the U.S. northeastern seaboard. Like with the L boats, electric boat and lake did things slightly differently, but they end up with the same range and speed, so we'll just review the electric boat design. 147 feet long, a 16-foot beam with a surface displacement of 347 tons and 4 18-inch torpedo tubes, bow, with 8 reloads. No deck gun, 2 diesels, crew of 25, 2 officers and 23 enlisted. Surface speed of 13 knots and 11 knots submerged, with a surface range of 3,500 nautical miles. And these boats will be scrapped by 1931. So they were actually, in a way, kind of a step back from what they were trying to achieve, certainly with the M class. Okay, last but not least, the O class. 16 boats built between 1916 and 1918. These are considered to be the first truly good submarines with reliable diesel engines, and we'll talk about engines in U.S. boats another time. Construction Repair was impressed with the boats because they were the first ever built that completed trials meeting the contract requirements. These boats also benefited from improvements to habitability, berthing for each sailor, personal locker, and things like evaporators to make fresh water. Now, as with the L and N classes, construction of these boats was built between electric boat, lake boat, and the government yards, with some design differences. In particular, the electric boats, they used the rotating cap on the bow, and lake used shutters. These boats deployed to the Azores as a group, but World War I ended before they could actually reach it, so they never saw any action during the war. 9 boats would be decommissioned and mostly scrapped by 1924, but 7 boats were mothballed and would eventually be recommissioned and used as trainers during World War II. Now, it says something that the Navy felt like these boats were worth holding on to, although there would be consequences. We'll talk about that another time. Okay, now the stats for the electric boat hulls. 172 feet long, 18-foot beam with a surface displacement of 520 tons, 4 18-inch bow torpedo tubes and 8 reloads, 1 deck gun, 2 diesels, a crew of 29, 2 officers, 27 enlisted. Friedman doesn't have endurance numbers for this class in his book, and I think that's because they're pretty similar in dimensions to the L class. So we'll just assume 3,150 nautical miles standard and 550 nautical miles using the main ballast tanks for fuel storage, because that's what Wikipedia says, 5,500. So I think that's probably how they interpreted it. So this wraps up our look at early U.S. submarines, classes H through O, that were boats intended to operate in U.S. coastal waters. The next time we come back to U.S. subs, we'll start talking about the fleet boats. I hope you enjoyed this briefing, and if you have any questions, post them below, or head over to the Submarine History Discord and ask your question there. Till next time, peace out.